Welcome to the first episode of the Cybercrime and Business Podcast, the weekly podcast that's focused exclusively on how the world of cybercrime is impacting business. This episode is brought to you by SurfWatch Labs. SurfWatch Labs delivers cyber risk intelligence solutions that help organizations understand the potential for cyber attacks, determine the impact to their business, and proactively address threats head-on. Hello, today is November 14th, 2014. I am Jeff Peters, the HackSurfer editor. I'm here with Matt Lichtfuss, a HackSurfer writer, and Michael Thell, SurfWatch Labs data analyst. And a little bit later, at the end of the podcast, we'll be playing an interview with Brian Foster. He's the CTO of Damballa, and we talked about the Backoff malware and all the recent point-of-sale breaches that are in the news. I guess to get us kicked off, Matt, you're sort of a writer for HackSurfer, and you write a lot of stories. I'm just kind of curious. I imagine Home Depot is probably sort of the big story this week with the news of all their email addresses being stolen. Is that what you found?
Yeah, when we were taking a look, when we were going through some data, we came up with some of the top discussed cybercrimes for the weekend. As a lot of our readers and viewers know, Home Depot has kind of been discussed, a lot recently since their breach. And they had a new development. On top of the 56 million credit cards that were stolen, they discovered that 53 million email addresses were also compromised. So it's kind of like the reach of this breach is not done, unfortunately, and the company has warned their customers to watch out for phishing scams as part of the problem with these emails being compromised. So that's the new development with Home Depot this week.
Yeah, and I guess what stood out to me when I was reading all the news stories, and I actually did a couple interviews and wrote a little bit about it, was just how much the Home Depot breach is pretty much identical to the Target breach in so many ways. With the Target breach, it was, 40 million credit cards, and then a little bit later we found out that it was also all the personal information that was stolen. And then a little bit later, when we learned about how the breach happened, it was stolen credentials from a third-party vendor. And it's pretty much the exact same story here with the Home Depot breach. We have a lot of credit cards that were stolen, and then we found out about all the email addresses this week. And then it was the same way that the hackers got into the system was the third-party credentials that were compromised. So I thought this kind of interesting in that, we see all these retail breaches and they seem to play out the exact same way again and again and again. And that's something that one of the people we were speaking to, we had a supply chain webinar a couple weeks ago, and Wayne Wheelis of Release to Innovations, he basically said that, despite all these retail breaches, it's pretty much that the cyber criminals are using the exact same playbook, the exact same play again and again and again. They get in through a third-party vendor, they steal all the personal information, they steal all the financial information. So obviously there's new malware out there, but it seems like the criminals are kind of sticking to just they found something that works and they keep doing it again and again.
And if I could add, just in the discussion of the overall effects of this breach, while credit card numbers are important, for obvious reasons, the email addresses could be even more important, given that these lists of these 53 million email addresses could be, as they said, used in phishing scams. But the overall indirect effects of the theft of these email addresses could be boundless, given that criminals could develop botnets that are used in DDoS attacks, or botnets could be also used in stealing other credit cards. So to a certain extent, these email addresses could be even more valuable than the credit cards in the longer term.
Yeah, and in terms of sort of that supply chain and other people kind of getting damaged, like you're talking about with phishing, I think one thing that, at least I know I don't think about it much, and I think in a lot of the stories it's not really covered as well, is just people focus on Home Depot and is their stock price getting affected or anything like that. But actually, there's one story I saw this week. It said that credit unions have spent $60 million on the Home Depot breach. I think they had 7.2 million of the stolen cards were credit union cards. And I think it was a price of $8.02 per card, basically, that they were paying for fraud and all the related expenses. So basically, when a big, huge breach like this happens, it's affecting all the credit unions. I also read an article about all the small businesses that are being affected. I think it was LexisNexis. They published a survey which said in 2013 that the average merchant loses 0.68% of their annual income to fraud. And the merchant has to pay around $3.08 on each dollar to replace the losses, penalties, and chargeback fees with fraudulent charges and stuff. So I just think it's important to realize that, I think that's one aspect that a lot of the stories miss and a lot of the media misses is just, how wide-ranging, the effects of a breach can be. So Matt, was there any other stories besides Home Depot that stood out to you this week?
Yeah, there were. The next one, Apple Incorporated, was the number 2 most discussed target this week, and Apple, as we all know, and I'm sure a lot of readers know, it has been in the news a lot. Number 1, Apple is probably viewed as top of the line tech-wise. Always kind of played on, they were impenetrable. It just, you didn't hear a lot of issues with them, but recently they have just been plagued with attacks. The most recent attack is something called a mask attack, and this showed up in news, and this is being dubbed as being very dangerous and could affect a lot of users. And what this attack is, for Apple iOS phones, because of the way that the permissions that they give, there's a vulnerability, and the vulnerability is that a hacker can go on an iOS phone, replace an application. Let's say a user was viewing their bank account through one of these iOS apps. A hacker could replace that application with a malicious app that looks completely identical to the the original app, and all the information that the user is uploading onto this application, well, the hacker's getting it. Very dangerous. Something that just came up in news, so that's probably what's driving the discussion for Apple this week.
And this morning I was actually looking at some of the SurfWatch Labs data, and basically it went all the way back to January 1st of this year because I was just kind of interested in what was sort of the most discussed targets for the whole year, and we were kind of looking at all sorts of different sort of brand sort of damage kind of things I wanted to check out. And Home Depot is actually number 1 on the list for the year in terms of most discussed cybercrime targets. But what surprised me was Apple was actually at number 4, and so number 2 was Microsoft, number 3 was Android, and then number 4 was Apple. And that kind of surprised me just because, from my perspective, on HackSurfer.com and all the other sort of news sites I read, it seems like everyone always talks about how Android is sort of, so much worse than Apple or iOS in terms of, malware and things like that. But Apple's actually really close to surpassing Android in terms of cybercrime discussion. And it's actually possible that, by the end of the year, if a couple more, attacks happen or people continue to discuss it, that we could possibly see the end of the year where Apple is more discussed in terms of cybercrime than Android. So I just thought that was kind of interesting about the whole story.
To add what you're saying, Jeff, there's been, over the longest term, there's been an assumption that Apple products have more or less, as Matt alluded to earlier, been impenetrable, that no one really, Macs or Apple products don't get viruses. But as this example, this data points out, that's no longer the case. Therefore, consumers especially, since consumers use these products, really need to have some sort of endpoint security solutions on their Apple computers. I personally use Apple products and have, I have my own virus scans and everything on here, but that'd be something that'd be highly recommended because it's no longer the case. And again, and in addition, Apple's market share when it comes to iOS devices and computers has steadily increased over the last couple of years, and this area has become such a bigger target for cyber criminals that folks need to start paying more attention to it.
Yeah, Matt, I think weren't you working on a story as well, talking about how Apple was at an all-time high for stock prices?
Yeah, this is an article I actually just wrote today. reported yesterday that Apple all-time market cap value, I think it was $659 billion. That might not be correct, but I think that's right. Stock price at an all-time high. And one thing I took a look at is kind of what we're discussing. You know, Apple is vastly popular, but they've had a lot of problems lately, and it just seems like consumers, either they're unaware of it, or if they are aware, you know, they don't care because, well, it's Apple and I got to get my hands on it. And, you know, we have this mask attack. Now we have, the week before was wire lurker. We've had another problem that was called ad thief that stole ads. It was like an ad stealing program that hackers are putting up there. So, and then of course we had the celebrity nude photos, or the fappening, or whatever else it was being called. So there's been a lot going on with Apple this year.
Yeah, I know there was a couple other popular stories that sort of came out this week. One of them was, I think, the USPS. I actually didn't really follow this story very closely. I just haven't had a chance to read much about it. So I don't know, did you get a chance, Matt, to sort of read a little bit about that, and you can maybe tell us, you know, what happened there?
Yeah, and this was another article that I wrote earlier this week. United States Postal Service had a breach. It affected 800,000 of their employees' data. So 800,000 employees had their data compromised. On top of that, anyone, so this was even someone like myself potentially, anyone who contacted the United States Postal Service Customer Care Center between January and August via email or telephone, potentially the information given through that was also compromised. There's been a little speculation. People are saying, you know, I've seen a couple reports claiming that the Chinese were involved in the hack. I personally haven't seen anything to substantiate that, but I think, as we both know, it's really hard to point who would, you know, who's actually behind a hack. I mean, if it was that easy, I think we would get a lot of these people out of the way, but that might be a tall order. So that's what's going on with the United States Postal Service.
To stay in that same vein of the U.S. government and certain attacks aimed at it, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, or agency, I should say, also suffered a breach that was just reported this week, in addition to the United States Postal Service. And again, Chinese hackers are allegedly accessed databases of the agency. What was more interesting about this, though, is that when NOAA discovered the attack, they didn't tell anyone, allegedly, about it, and rather they went down for what they called unscheduled maintenance at the end of September, which affected the data streams for weather modeling in the United States and around the world. But not only is that a big part of the story, but the reporting and not telling the proper officials is really what's gotten no one in trouble. But again, the information that Chinese hackers were allegedly were responsible for the attack came from a congressman or a third-party source, and there has not been any sort of evidence linking the Chinese to this attack.
Yeah, in terms of just sort of the government sector, this morning when I was playing around with the data as well, I noticed that in terms of, you know, sort of distinct, you know, industry targets, you know, like companies or entities that are attacked, healthcare had, you know, sort of by far the most, but number two is actually the government sector. So, I mean, obviously there's a lot of potential targets. You know, you got local governments, state governments, federal governments, you know, around the world. So there's a lot of potential targets, but I thought that was interesting just in terms of, you know, just the number of attacks that have sort of happened against government targets. Yeah, so that was sort of the third, I guess, biggest story of the week. You know, we had Home Depot, we have Apple, we have the United States Postal Service. Is there anything else out there, Matt, that you found?
Now, in terms of what's being heavily discussed, after the top three there, those are the big dogs, and then there is a wide conglomeration of, you know, multiple areas being discussed. So instead of trying to point out, you know, which one was 1/100th of a decimal point more discussed, I decided to pick two topics that I found interesting, I think are pretty big news that people should be aware of. Number 4 is a malware called BadUSB. Now, this is something that I had never heard of. I obviously joined HackSurfer in September, and this, from what I'm understanding, this really kind of came to light during the summertime. But when I started reading this, wow, I mean, this is a pretty big potential threat. BadUSB, like I said, is a malware that specifically targets USB devices. And the problem, over the summer, they said that this flaw was unpatchable. There was nothing that could be done. So imagine that. I mean, if you have malware on a USB, okay, you can't fix it. Well, now what do you do? Recently, why it's back in news is because it was discovered that about half of devices are actually vulnerable to the flaw. But there's no way to test to see if your device is vulnerable. So according to the articles I read, you have to kind of test it yourself and, you know, pray, I guess. And as of right now, there is not a list of what USB devices are vulnerable versus not. So kind of big news that I see.
And what I read about it was that it's more that there's really no way of knowing like what's in your USB device, because a lot of these devices are made, you know, they switch out, you know, based on, you know, whoever's got the lowest cost for what they actually put in there in terms of the chips and the technology. And, you know, like if you go into Walmart and you buy a laptop or you go into Best Buy, you know, it's clearly labeled what chips in there, what technology is in there. But if you go to the USB rack, there's no labeling of what's in there. And, you know, from what I read, within a particular USB device, there might be potentially a handful or maybe even like a dozen sort of different pieces that are in there that they kind of swap out as they make the USB devices. So even if you do know the brand, it goes beyond that. You need to know sort of what's inside there, and I think that's sort of part of the problem. So you mentioned that there was another topic besides the BadUSB. What was sort of the fifth one that we can kind of close out discussing?
Yeah, and this was, I found this interesting, maybe, you know, partly because it was my favorite pizza place growing up, but Pizza Hut in, well, Australian Pizza Huts, I should say, to be more specific. In Australia this week, 60 Australian Pizza Hut stores were breached through a very common way that these retail stores are being breached through point-of-sale systems and terminals. This particular malware is the Zero Access Rootkit, which showed up on the scene back in 2011. That was the vector for the attack. It's important to point out that Microsoft, in December of last year, they led this big operation to try to get rid of this, but apparently were unsuccessful totally because it did show up in Australia, and that is what affected these Pizza Huts.
Yeah, and just in terms of point-of-sale breaches, you know, kind of we got the Home Depot breach and Pizza Hut, and, you know, there's so many other ones, you know, Dairy Queen, Orange Julius, Kmart, Jimmy John's. There's been so many recently. And when I was, you know, looking at writing a story about the Home Depot breach, I actually went back and looked at the 2014 Verizon Data Breach Investigations Report. And there was an interesting thing in there which I saw, which said in 99% of all the retail breaches, the breach was actually discovered by like an outside source, like a law enforcement agency or, you know, like a bank's fraud detection service or whatever. So it's kind of shocking that, you know, despite the fact that we've seen so many retail breaches, basically 0% practically of the breaches are actually getting discovered, you know, by the actual companies themselves. Pretty much the only reason that they're getting discovered is because the criminals are then taking the card numbers and going and making fraudulent purchases, and then that kind of, you know, wakes everyone up to the problem. So that's one of the questions I actually asked Brian Foster, the CTO of Damballa, and, you know, we'll play that interview here in a second, and you can kind of get his opinion on there. But I just thought that was an interesting aspect of this.
And to add, retailers are also frustrated by what's going on. And recently, it came out that retailers sent a letter to Congress, congressional leaders specifically, asking for federal data protection legislation. Currently, 47 states in the District of Columbia currently have data breach notification laws on the book. The problem is that each law or each rule in each jurisdiction has different notification rules, and one bigger thing is have different definitions of what personal information it means. So it could be social security numbers, it could be names and addresses, it could that type of information differs based off of the data notification law. So will Congress act to do this? Time will only tell. Time will only tell.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of people sort of wanting it to happen, but just with I don't know, the way people view Congress, and I guess myself included, I'm a little skeptical.
Yeah, and before we move on from this, another thing, and Jeff, you were kind of talking about it, and I think, you know, with all of us, you know, we see it because we're in the cybersecurity, you know, spectrum. But this attack, like you said, Jeff, they didn't even realize the attack happened until they started saying, oh, people are using these, you know, fraudulent credit cards. Like, whoa, what's this coming from? But in this attack especially, it was in the system that the hackers are in there for an entire year before, you know, it was discovered. And it's just, to me, that's just, I don't know if that's like typical for a lot of these attacks. I know with some of them, they were in there for an amount of time, but a year seems like a really long time. So I just thought that was really interesting too.
Yeah, and like I said, that's something that's basically what the interview with Brian Foster is about. We're going to talk about sort of the Backoff malware and a lot of these point-of-sale breaches. But before we play that interview, we got our cyber tip of the week. This is from HackSurfer user Robert Siciliano. He had written a piece about how, you know, he's traveling through airports, and he was talking about how he's basically accidentally become a visual hacker. And it was something I really hadn't thought about much. Most people think of hacking, you know, they think of breaking into a computer or breaking into a network. And he was talking about as he's flown, you know, thousands of miles every year, he's in the airports or he's on a plane. Basically, he sees a lot of screens. He sees people working, checking their email, things like that. So he was talking about how just to be wary of sort of the visual hacking aspect. And he wrote, you know, the visual hacker prowls the public, seeking out computer screens, displaying sensitive data. And companies like 3M are now offering privacy filters, which blacks out content that can be viewed from side angles, and also alerts people to people snooping over their shoulders. And he said, I'm seeing more and more of these in flight, which frankly is nice and less distracting. So, you know, for a lot of the business people out there, that's something I don't really think about much. You know, people actually just looking at your phone or looking at your computer screen, and that's something to think about. I think a lot of times we can get so wrapped up in sort of the complex malware and things like that we can forget to do some of the basic things like that.
And the solution is pretty cheap. It's only about $30 or $40, and you can get them at any store, and it's this black sheet. You just pop it onto your computer screen. Simple.
So no more watching my neighbor's movie while I'm flying to a destination anymore. Well, I think I can handle that. I think I can live with that for the upgraded security, I suppose. Yeah, you guys are right.
All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining us this week. We have now an interview with Brian Foster, the CTO of Damballa. I guess the first thing on my mind is there's just an insane number of retail breaches. I mean, at least that's sort of my perception. I don't know if you really agree with that. It just seems like this year has it seems like every week there's a new one coming out.
Yeah, absolutely, right. I mean, I think that, you know, if you just have to pick up the news to see that some new retailer has been breached and, you know, and their customers' credit card data has been compromised. So it's timely.
Yeah, so there was one stat in your guys' report that kind of stood out to me. Everyone's kind of been talking about this Backoff malware. I think it was a couple months back, the Secret Service said up to 1,000 businesses might have been infected by it. And in your report, it said, I believe there's a 57% increase from August to September. And then in October, it's grown an additional 33%. So I'm just maybe wondering, you know, for like the businesses out there, the people who are curious, if you could explain, you know, what is this Backoff malware and then who is it targeting?
Yeah, for sure. So, and just to give you an update, since we've produced the report, so back when we produced the report, from August to September, we've seen a 57% increase in the number of infections of Backoff in our customers' networks. And then from September to October, we saw a 33%. And then just from the beginning of October to now, we've seen a 67% increase. So we continue to see momentum there. in number of detections that we're finding around Backoff. But if I take a step back about Backoff, right? So Backoff is really just one of millions of malware mutations that are out there. And this particular one, though, is really focused on breaking into point-of-sale networks and stealing credit card data. And I know back in kind of the middle of the year, I think it was believed 600 retailers were hit by it. I think the more recent estimates are it's over 1,000 now. But as I said, it's primarily focused on getting into an environment, point-of-sale devices, and being in the loop on when they swipe their credit cards, gathering that credit card information so that people can take that credit card information and go create fake credit cards that they can use fraudulently in other places.
Yeah, and you mentioned that it's been increasing a lot. I'm wondering if that's like new infections, if this Backoff malware is actively infecting new people, or if it's just that it's being discovered more and detected more, and now these businesses who've been infected for the last 6 months are now finally discovering it.
Well, in our networks, these are typically new infections, or in a lot of cases, new customers. So it's to clarify for Damballa what Damballa does. We sit into people's networks and we look for these active infections and we find them. And so certainly as we get new customers, new retail customers, you can see that increase is just related to that. We do find, and I think we mentioned this in that state of infections report, that customers that actively triage these infections and remove them and so forth typically have a lower reinfection rate, if you will. So a lot of this, in my opinion, based on I look at the data, is that these are new infections, and it's to be expected. We're entering the busiest time of the year for retail, and this is when they want to get into the every retailer basically is going to have a time of the year where they lock down their IT systems for the holidays, and every hacker's dream is to be part of the image that gets locked down because they know they're there for a couple months, right? Mm-hmm. And so everybody's racing to get it, and get out there on those machines and start gathering credit card data.
Yeah, and you said it's to be expected. I'm just wondering why this malware, or just point-of-sale malware in general, is booming so much, and it seems to be working so well. Or maybe that's just my perception. Maybe I'm wrong on that.
Yeah.
I mean, is there any sort of reason you think why it's infecting so many businesses?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is there's a couple of things it's complicated. There's a lot of things, of course, are related to it, but there's a couple of things that I pick on that are important to me. For a lot of retailers, especially companies that are smaller in size, they actually have a third party that they rely on that owns these machines and maintains these machines. And so it's kind of like a supply chain for this retailer in a way, and that they rely on them to maintain and own the system that transacts these credit cards and whatnot. And so even though it's mom and pop's flower shop, the point of sale devices in there are actually owned by a third party, maintained by a third party. And so a lot of the smaller businesses, don't feel like they own those devices to know what's securing their information. And I think part of what needs to happen is we talk about this. I do think that you need to hold your third party accountable for the security of these devices if you have a third party that manages and places these in your stores. But the other issue, and this has come out a lot in the press, is the amount of security that people are relying on to protect these devices and the information in them. And I come from, just a quick background, I spent 21 years at Symantec and 5 at McAfee, and so I spent a lot of time building antivirus solutions, and I can just tell you plain of fact that it's too easy for the malware writers, the threat actors, to tweak the malware so that your typical antivirus software can't detect it. And that is exacerbated in the point-of-sale environment where these devices are not updated all the time. So not only are they not updated all the time, they don't have the latest virus signatures or definitions. So it doesn't take much for a virus writer or threat actor to tweak this version of Backoff so it's undetectable by the major antivirus companies and get it out there, and then it's undetectable. And then once again, it gets into that lockdown image that's the point-of-sale devices for the holiday season, and they're skimming card numbers.
Yeah, you kind of brought up small businesses there, and that's something that it's always sort of in the back of my mind, because at HackSurfer we're always trying to talk about keeping cybersecurity simple, and I think small businesses are kind of underserved in a lot of these cybersecurity situations. But I just imagine if I'm if I'm a person who owns a small business and you see all these names like Home Depot, Target, Kmart, Dairy Queen, Pizza Hut. If you see all these names in the news, I can see how they feel, kind of helpless, like what can they do? So, I mean, you kind of spoke about holding these providers responsible. I mean, is there any sort of practical tips someone's listening could kind of take and apply?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, understanding what the third parties are doing to secure the data and asking those questions and being a little bit thorough in inspecting, how they secure that data, and then also understanding, what happens if your information is breached and stolen. How do you deal with it and whatnot? So I think that's a big part of what small businesses do. And then, I do know, because I've talked to these companies, there are companies out there that differentiate by offering more secure point of sale networks and devices. And I think what we're discovering is that these devices aren't just commodity devices, and that security is a way to differentiate for these point of sale devices. And if somebody in the supply chain can make a more secure point of sale device that's better locked down, then it may be worth a few dollars more, if you will, to ensure that. So.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to get your opinion on is, I was kind of covering the Home Depot breach and looking into some studies, and I looked back at the 2014 Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report, and in there's an interesting point. I'll quote here real quick. It says, in 99% of cases, someone told the victim that they had suffered a breach. This is no different than in years past, and we continue to see notification by law enforcement and fraud detection as the most common discovery methods. They're talking about retail breaches. So basically, in 99% of retail breaches, the business isn't actually discovering the breach. It's basically the criminals are selling the cards, and then that's how they kind of catch on to it. So from that point of view, it seems like everyone's kind of doing a pretty horrible job, because basically pretty much 0% of breaches are actually getting detected by the businesses. I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do, absolutely. I mean, part of the problem, and once again, I can rely on just my own past experience, is, I spent 20 years building the walls higher inside of IT and security to try to make it so that the attacks don't get in the first place. And I think as we look around and survey the IT landscape today, you see a lot of organizations that have put kind of all their eggs in the prevention basket. Let's prevent these attacks from happening in the first place. And once again, in my career, I've built a lot of prevention tools whose job it is to prevent the attacks. And a lot of them are still very effective, but none of these preventative tools are 100%. Things are getting through. But what hasn't happened is, a reasonable level of investment on detecting the things that get through and responding to those. And I think that we're waking up to this now. And so you are seeing organizations start to recognize, and you're also seeing analyst firms start to recognize that there needs to be a more balanced approach to investing in the detect and respond part of IT security, not just the preventative side. And so the reason why 90% or such a high percentage of these attacks are found from the outside is because people have been trying to prevent things and assuming their prevention's working and not actually spending time to detect the things that get through. And of course, that's a little bit of a commercial for Damballa, because that's what we do. But it also gives me the chance to talk to all the customers who are now recognizing that they do need to detect and find the things that get through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you spoke about, how the holiday season's coming up, and I guess last year, I really wasn't thinking too much about retail breaches until, sort of Target hit around Christmas time last year. So I'm wondering, since 2014 has been kind of so ramped up all year long, if you maybe expect or kind of anticipate, a lot more activity still this holiday season, and for it to get, even worse, or if you kind of think we've seen the worst of it.
No, I mean, I'm not quite ready for my 2015 predictions, but I would be willing to predict that, there'll be some retail outlets that'll make the news this fall and winter with breaches. I think one of the things that I think is probably frustrating for all of us is that, it was over a year ago that Target was breached, and then 10 months later, Home Depot's breached, right? And so how quickly and realizing that there's a challenge in IT security to move things fast, especially with these point-of-sale devices, but how quickly can retail move to provide better security on these devices so they don't get breached? But I do feel that we're still in the middle of this wave, and certainly looking at the number of Backoff infections that we see in the data we see, it would lead me to believe that, yeah, there'll be a couple more big breaches that we'll hear about. Although, I wonder if maybe we're getting a little bit immune and numb to them. But I think they will happen this fall.
Yeah, then the final question then, just sort of looking forward, I wonder if there's any sort of things that you kind of see that maybe stand out, particularly in the sort of point of sale or kind of space. A lot of articles are talking about how, there needs to be a change and just kind of with all the news and stuff that's happening. So I'm wondering if you think maybe there will be a change, with businesses or kind of just related to business, how they could sort of learn and kind of grow from this.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a couple changes. I've already talked about one, which is the shift in the budget and the mindset from prevention only to prevent, detect, and respond, and that kind of balance. But, I think another shift that's taking place is I also think that organizations are going to start putting more money into security. There's been some analysis done that looked at what's been the impact to Target since their breach, and it's a large number. A gentleman, Gray Powell at Wells Fargo, did this analysis, and I think he came up with something like a $700 million impact to Target, and their internal IT security budget $70 million. So it was, what we're seeing and taking place is going to lead organizations to, I think, look at their security spend and realize that they probably need different metrics for their organization in terms of what the right amount of security spend is. And we've seen, J.P. Morgan Chase came out, their CEO, say, hey, we spend $250 million on security, and we're going to be doubling that over the next 5 years. And I think that's the phenomenon we're going to see across the different verticals, because the only way they're going to be able to compete and hold the confidence of their customers is to make sure that their transactions are secure. And so that's the other change I think coming, is we are going to start seeing, an uptick in the amount of money and budget that organizations set aside for security. And that's not just security products, that's security people, processes, and products.
All right. Well, thanks for taking the time, Brian. We appreciate it.
No problem. I enjoyed it anytime, Jeff.
That's it for the first episode of the Cybercrime and Business Podcast. Be sure to check out HackSurfer.com and SurfWatchLabs.com for more info.